Hi everyone, thank you for being here. It's a very long day, I guess, but the pizzas were good. So, my name is Samah Krichah in Arabic, Samah Krichah in English or whatever. I love how people in South Africa call me because it's like summer, the season. I work as head of training and learning at the Women's Budget Group. The Women's Budget Group is a UK-based think and do tank. It was created in the late 80s by a group of feminist economists, among them Professor Diane Ellison, Sue Himmelwhite, Ruth Pearson. I don't know if you know any of these names. They were working pro bono for a long time, providing budget analysis, submitting budget statements to the government, lobbying, advocating towards different departments. And they've been ignored for a very long time, until in '94 someone quoted the Women's Budget Group at the Parliament, and since then we are consulted every time to provide analysis of the budget and the spending and other thematic and sectorial kind of economic policies. I joined the Women's Budget Group 2 years ago. The international program is quite new, even though a lot of people have been working on and off in different places of the world. And our relationship with South Africa is very, very, very old because Professor Diane Ellison was one of the people who helped put in place the gender responsive budgeting program in 1995. I've been asked to talk about gender responsive budgeting and fiscal policy, but both of these topics are intertwined and cannot be kind of dislocated from each other. How many of you have heard of gender responsive budgeting? Good. Who knows that they have a gender responsive budgeting program in their country? What's your country? South Africa. What other countries are there? Kenya, Malawi, Lesotho, and Morocco. Do you know that you have you actually have a gender responsive budgeting program? Gender responsive budgeting, what it is not a separate budget for women, and it is not a separate budget for vulnerable groups. It's an approach to budgeting that takes into consideration everyone's needs, women, men, boys and girls, and challenges assumptions of neoclassical economy that considers, for example, the household as a homogeneous entity. It aims at mitigating the negative impact of mainstream budgeting on women and marginalized groups, but also it's needs-based. It aims to responding to the needs of every population group. It ensures gender equitable access to and distribution of resources, removing inefficiencies where money is spent where it shouldn't be spent and underspent where it shouldn't be underspent. The approach also analyzes the effect on women, men, and the gender roles associated with them, and how spending reinforces certain gender roles and perpetuates oppression and discrimination. And it transforms budgets to achieve gender equality commitments. Gender responsive budgeting as an approach has two sides. One of them is technical, that includes all the tools used to implement gender responsive budgeting, but also political, because without a strong political will to adopt gender responsive budgeting, there is no reprioritization of the spending, and things will continue to happen as they are. At the Women's Budget Group, we think that gender responsive budgeting sits at the center of feminist economics because it should centralize the idea of care and public equality duty. It should move from a growth mindset in the economy, or a growth approach into the economy, to a well-being approach, and we've spoken about this in the last days, It promotes investment in social infrastructure, and we will give an example in a minute about this. And as I said, it's a tool for needs-based equality. This is one of our proudest production, and it shows how care work is central to the question of inequality, and a lot of speakers here spoken about it, but we like to showcase it in this way, showing how care work prevents women from accessing equal opportunities and good services throughout their life, from birth to death. How having caring responsibilities, for example, prevents women from earning as much as men, saving as much as men. They are more likely to be in poverty in old age. They are less likely to own assets, more likely to have discrimination in the workplace. And these inequalities that are related to care work intensify with intersection with other factors such as race, disability, class, sexuality, and age. And to know more about this, I encourage you to look for the intersectional analysis of austerity on our website. For example, it shows that austerity in the UK affects more severely Black Caribbean women who are single mothers, heads of household, for example. And then the less women have money and financial independence, the more likely they are to be victims of violence against women and abuse. So gender-responsive budgeting as an approach is not one size fits all. It's not one approach, the same one that is applied in every country, and it is a big mistake to do so. Context is key, but what is common between all contexts is 4 steps. First one is to gather data on women and men separately, which is known as sex-disaggregated or gender-disaggregated data. The second one is improving how we listen to the community, so we know the actual needs of each group and each population, especially underrepresented groups. The third step is analyzing the impact of spending on men and women separately, who benefits and who loses, and here I forgot to put the most important thing, also analyzing the impact of revenue collection, meaning tax. And the fourth step is developing measurable gender-sensitive solutions and monitor and audit them. Do you know what it is? This is a budget cycle. So the budget cycle starts with income projection through preparing, sorry, it's very poor quality and I apologize for that, to preparing departmental spending proposals until we go back to monitoring of outcomes, and then it goes again and again. It's in the green circle. The purple circle is what the government should do at every step. The government should analyze at every step its spending and the impact of every spending on different groups, namely men and women, boys and girls. And then the orange circle is what civil society and international NGOs are required to do, which is mostly advocate and lobby for a more effective implementation of gender-responsive budgeting. As we said, gender-responsive budgeting relies heavily on gender-sensitive data and gender-segregated, quality gender-segregated data. So gender-sensitive data needs to be disaggregated by sex or ideally by gender, but it's very hard most of the time to disaggregate it by gender. It needs consistency, as you said. Every 5 years you answer the same questions, for example, so you can track change, but also the way that data is collected right now mostly is on household level, treating the household as a homogeneous entity, while we've seen that in the first day The household is not a homogeneous entity. There is power dynamic without the household. There are people who have money, people who don't have money, people who have different life choices, different priorities. So to have a better gender-sensitive data, we need to design specific surveys, such as standalone time use survey, so we know where people spend their time, changing the questionnaires of regular surveys, such as household surveys, labor market surveys, etc., changing the way administrative data is collected, so it is also disaggregated at every department level, changing budget form to include the discussion of the gender impact of proposed expenditures, so we can collect feedback from people about their own needs, and changing the accounting system with special codes to indicate gender-targeted expenditure, so that information relating to individuals is gender disaggregated. And this is something that is used in one of the tools of gender-responsive budgeting called gender tagging. I don't know if you ever heard of gender tagging. We'll come to that in a bit. And it's crucial to have an effective, functional gender tagging. Some of the gender-responsive budgeting tools, as we said, it's an approach, it's not the budget itself. We have the gender impact assessment. Have you ever heard of gender impact assessment? No? Sex disaggregated beneficiary assessment, gender disaggregated public expenditure analysis, gender disaggregated tax incidence analysis, gender disaggregated analysis of the impact of the budget on time use, and gender-aware medium-term economic framework, gender-aware budget statements. And you can find more information on that link. I can share the presentation with you later. So these are a bit of complicated terms for most people, but when you come to know them, we'll go through 3 examples of these tools. They are similar in their objectives, but they take different routes. So for example, gender impact assessment is basically asking the question about every decision, every law, every program, every policy that the government decides. Will this reduce, maintain, or increase gender inequalities between men and women? So in the UK, there is something called equality, public duty equality, I don't know, which encourages the government to carry out gender impact assessment, but they are not obligatory. Some departments do it in a kind of box-ticking exercise, but to have an effective gender impact assessment that can inform later budgetary decisions, we need to have that assessment structured, systematic, analytical, and documented. So you have to give arguments to each of the decisions you are making and to show in which way this can help bridge gender gaps and advance gender equality in general. So it does not only analyze what is the policy is currently having as like impact on the gender equality, but also is required to provide a projection of what that policy is going to do for gender equality. Another tool of gender-responsive budgeting is gender disaggregated public expenditure analysis, and this means that we need to analyze the spending on a certain program. We need to analyze its gendered impact and then adjust accordingly. Ghanaian people, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I got this from the literature. For example, in Ghana, spending on education programs benefited women and girls less than men and boys because families tend to send their boys more to school, and then when they don't have enough money, the first thing they would do is to make their girls stay at home and take care of the household. But spending on health benefited poor women as much as poor men. So we know that we need probably to subsidize more education for women, for girls, than for boys, for example, because anyways they will go to school because they are the priority in their family. The third tool that is intimately related to the fiscal policy is a gender-disaggregated tax incidence analysis, and it's an overall analysis of the tax system, analyzing which taxes are regressive and which one are progressive, and we talked about this again in several sessions before. Examine how the direct and indirect taxes to see how much is paid by men and how much is paid by women, and how this affects gender roles. For example, something like the VAT is a tax that is mostly paid by women who go shopping, and it goes without noticing. You know, it's easier to raise funds, but it's not fair on people in general and on women in particular. So we also need to examine how much tax revenues are lost from tax dodging and wasteful tax incentives. For example, giving tax incentives to big corporations is literally throwing money out of the window and not collecting that money to do other things like development-related projects. So more dependence on indirect income tax, consumption or sale tax or VAT may impact on women who are responsible for the family budget. Although consumption tax exemptions can help mitigate these impacts. One of the exemptions, and I'm sure you all heard about it, is the pink tax. So if we can start by that. And then user fees are regressive, especially in education and health, as we said, because usually men and boys are the priority in the family spending. So if there are fees related to their health or education, they will be prevented from accessing these services. The third tool that we are going to talk about is the gender-disaggregated analysis of the impact of budget on time use. So how budgets can actually impact how people spend their time. For example, especially around care work. And we've seen this during COVID, and it was also talked about by other speakers, how COVID led women to spend more time providing care work, but also this happens in context of austerity. For example, in Ecuador, structural adjustment policies increased women's paid and unpaid work. They spent more time, in addition to the usual things of like educating their kids, taking care of the young and the elderly, etc. But they also spent more time shopping for cheaper food and preparing food. Imagine, it's at the very granular level of detail that it happens. Also, as mothers took on more paid work, girls and families took on more family responsibilities. So it means that they were less likely to go to school. So it's kind of, you know, how do you call it? A butterfly effect. And it's borne by women, as usual. Anyways, what is needed for effective gender-responsive budgeting? Data, for sure. Gender analysis, but like effective, deep gender analysis is not done just to tick the box. Capacity building of people within the government, but also in civil society, so they can fulfill the different roles that we saw, what we've seen in the budget cycle. Bottom-up approaches to inform effective decision-making. So we need to ask people what they need, actually. Rely on more detailed census data, for example. Ask more qualitative questions in the surveys. Strong political will, that is probably the first thing, but it's not sufficient at all because, for example, in South Africa there is a political will, but the way gender-responsive budgeting is implemented is still questionable, and we'll come to that in a bit. And then for all of that, we need allocation of resources to implement gender-responsive budgeting, because it needs resources for the systems to be put in place in order to change how we collect data, how we train people, especially inside the government, how we change financial systems. Like, for example, last year I was here in South Africa, and I was doing a training with the Western Cape government, and one of the problems was that the fiscal system at the provincial level is very different from the one at the central level. So they could not harmonize the data, and like, yeah. The capacity building point is very important because there is a lot of programs that are run on gender responsive budgeting within the government. Ironically, it's run by structures like the IMF, and the IMF is the one responsible also for austerity policies, so it hurts and remedies at the same time. In a sense that it does not tackle the roots of inequality. To implement gender responsive budgeting, we need to rethink the system from the outset, from scratch. Think about, have a well-being approach in mind. Think about what would make people thrive and not only survive. What would benefit people more than corporations, for example. And it needs to be heavily contextualized. So this is like a very superficial kind of presentation, but like every context is different, and every GRB program needs to be adapted to the context. For the capacity building, it needs to be at all stages and in all departments. For example, in Morocco, they have done that. They established GRB units in all ministries. They trained people, but you know, you are an economist and you are not even aware of that program. It says something, you know. It needs to be continuous. It needs to have protocols complemented by real-life case studies. For example, at the Women's Budget Group, we did a training for the General Auditor's Office in Cyprus, for example, where we went through their own document, and we worked with them on gendering outcomes and outputs. We need institutional commitments, monitoring and evaluation so we can improve the delivery of gender-responsive budgeting, and accountability by the parliament and civil society. And for the implementation of GRB in South Africa, one of the problems is the heavy reliance on gender tagging. And gender tagging is, as we see here, is a systematic classification of budget allocations or policies according to their intended or potential impact on gender equality. It involves assigning tags or markers or codes to public expenditures to identify whether they are specifically designed to advance gender equality, contribute indirectly to gender equality, or are not targeted at gender outcomes, meaning gender neutral. And in my opinion, there is no policy that is gender neutral. And this is a very problematic approach because it's, again, a box-ticking exercise in a lot of contexts. For example, in India, and I don't know if anyone has more information about that, they tag a lot of expenditures as promoting gender equality or gender principle, but they are not in the end because you cannot see the effect and the results in real life. It should be used strategically, but also in combination with gender analysis, with gender impact assessment, with more qualitative information to complement the gender tagging. And it needs to be used in a way that is rights-based, focused on fulfilling women's and marginalized group economic and social rights, and outcome-focused in a way that it aims at reducing inequality. And one of the things that my beloved Diane Elson says is tagging is useful for visibility, but we must ask what is being tagged, why, and with what effect. So It is not, again, a box-ticking exercise. It's something that requires a lot of effort, a lot of analysis. This is a table showing how gender tagging can be effective. So gender tagging alone is problematic because it can be tokenistic or mislabeling and limited for decision making for people to say, we are using gender responsive budgeting because we are using gender tagging. But to be effective, it needs to be strategic, evidence-backed, informed by evidence-based assessment, and supports planning, budgeting, and evaluation. It's not a goal in itself, it's a tool. Coming to gender responsive budgeting, this is something that we have done a few years ago. We have a casebook called Women Count. It's a casebook of how the use of gender responsive budgeting can improve certain sectors. For example, the investment in public investment in social infrastructure that most governments are reluctant to do, on the long run will provide more benefits than investment in grey economy, for example. So if the UK invested 2% of its GDP in care work, in like care jobs, it would create 1,500,000 jobs. 75% of them will go to women, while the investment in construction, it would create only 750,000 jobs that would go mostly to men. And then one of the biggest problems in the UK, for example, is childcare. Childcare in the UK is the most expensive in Europe, and providing a free universal childcare in the UK would cost about 3% of the GDP, which might seem a lot, but it would lead to create 2 million full-time jobs, and 75% of them would go to women as well. And then that investment will result in a return of investment that is quick enough, because it will be done through tax revenue, but also it will reduce social security spending on people out of work, because they will start working, so they will have incomes and more earnings. There is a very interesting study that is done by Sue Himmelwhite and Jérôme de Horto across 7 OECD countries that actually talks more about this by sector, by level of investment, and compares 7 OECD countries. If you are interested, I can send it to you as well. Anyways, thank you. Hope it was not very draining for you. And